Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee LaValle McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about shadow. Shadow's a term that was coined by Carl Jung, famous Swiss psychologist. He was a student of Sigmund Freud. They had a terrible falling out because they disagreed on some major ideas. Times of great change are times of possibility of growth. Difficulty and challenge can be our friend if we know how to lean into them and see where they're calling us to grow or evolve. And one of the perpetual ways to understand personal growth is to continually become aware or conscious of parts of ourselves that need tending to, particularly parts of ourselves that we don't understand, that might be underdeveloped or even unconscious. I'm coming to feel more and more that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, that the individual self reflects the society, that what we go through in our own individual life is reflected in the larger culture. I find this super instructive and also really hopeful with the idea that we actually create the culture collectively and that the work that we do as individuals affects the health of the whole, much more potently than we might be aware or want to take responsibility for. So what is the shadow? The shadow is our unconscious parts of our personality, which our regular ego, our little narrative and story about ourselves, how we want to see ourselves, doesn't identify with. We all have a shadow. All light casts a shadow. In fact, Jung says that unfortunately there can be no doubt that man is on the whole, or woman, less good than he or she imagines themselves to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it will never get corrected. And the reason I wanted to do this podcast now is because of the powerful thing that's happening with Black Lives Matter. It's fascinating to me that the dark people in our culture actually hold the shadow of our culture. And it's a really intense and powerful burden. And right now we are being called to become conscious about it and to integrate and to rectify and grow culturally. One of the huge shadows of American culture is slavery. The American Constitution, the idea of a society built on diversity, built on equality and human rights. The intention that everyone has a say in what happens and that the move from monarchy and dictatorship into democracy is a huge social change. And certainly the United States has been a leader, a worldwide leader for a long time, since the end of World War II, going on about exactly 75 years now. And as much as we can complain about what's happening in America and things that we don't like, if you have ever been to a third world country or a second world country or traveled extensively, I always come back with intense appreciation for many of the rights and values that exist here. And with all of its limitations, I believe that many of the intentions of this country are truly great. But we're being called to grow and mature and evolve. America is a very young country. We actually haven't been through a lot compared to areas like Persia, Africa, even Western Europe. Great hardship gives us perspective. It humbles us in a good way and has us really incorporate and mature and grow from all the aspects of ourselves. You know, a couple of years ago, I got to spend some time in Germany, and I have so much respect for how the Germans have managed the incredible shadow of World War II and the Nazi experience. Talk about a shadow. Germany has been forced, certainly by the world, to really confront their shadow, and they teach it in schools, and people talk about it, and I got to have some really powerful conversations with Germans about what their perspective on World War II is, how they managed the Jewish Holocaust. It's really powerful. I know for myself, as a person who has had tremendous failure, that bankruptcy, alcoholism, drug addiction, divorce do not feel like failures to me anymore. They've become my greatest teachers. Those experiences and what it took to overcome them and to integrate them have become perhaps my greatest sources of strength and compassion for other people, and emotional and spiritual maturity, and my own humility. And I like the definition of humility as not being a small, meek person with low self-esteem. The idea of humility as a clear appraisal of who and what we really are, both good and bad, both developed and underdeveloped, my strengths and my deficits. Humility as a working principle of being able to focus on and use my gifts and talents, and simultaneously be leaning into and working on continual growth and maturity in my challenges. We need to do that individually, and we need to do that as a culture to remain healthy. And our country's in a critical time right now because we're being called to face our shadow, and what we choose to do with that will really determine the course of our future, as do all choices that we make. And when we face our shadow, our narrative about ourselves needs to change. And that can be frightening, and it can feel threatening, because it does require change and a move into the unknown. Now, not all shadow is negative, because all life energy holds valuable parts to it. And how we relate to our shadow, whether it's our own resentment or fear, or whether it's institutional shadow like racism, exploitation, and inequality, if we don't own and grow and incorporate our shadow, then dangerous things will happen. Because it doesn't go away. One of the most natural things that happens with the shadow is that we project it onto other people. There's a saying that when I'm pointing a finger at someone, there's actually 3 fingers pointing back at me. Often the people that most irritate us, if we really look deeply at it, they're doing things that we do that we don't want to look at ourselves. So looking at our individual shadow can be instructive to looking at the shadow of the whole. So the hard thing about shadow from an individual standpoint is that it's often unconscious. And the thing about things being unconscious is that they're not conscious. Because we live in an interactive universe, what we disown about ourselves will often show up externally. That's the idea of projection. So the author and teacher Carolyn Myss talks about us having 4 archetypes of shadow. She also calls them the archetypes of survival. As individuals, we all have them. And Myss talks about us having a wounded child, a saboteur, a prostitute, and a victim. When we can become aware of these aspects of ourselves and keep an eye on them, then we can actually get the gifts that they bring to us and help them mature and incorporate these parts of ourselves. Then they actually become helpers. When we can own our tendency to want to play the victim and blame others and not own our own power. When we live from our wounded child, which acts out old dysfunctional patterns and often refuses to stand in its adult self. Our inner saboteur, which is really about betrayal, how we undermine ourselves. It's often rooted in our low self-esteem. And we all do all these things. Working on a project, doing a piece of art, applying for a job. Any aspirations you might have that somehow never seem to work out. You don't seem to complete it or take the final step. Things remain undone. That's the saboteur. And our inner prostitute. Where do we compromise our own integrity? Where do we sell ourselves out? Do you keep dating the woman that you don't really care about because she's got a lot of money and a nice car? Do you stay at the job you hate for a company that has business practices that don't agree with your own values? Because your material prosperity is more important than your internal integrity. There's lots of ways we prostitute ourselves. People prostitute themselves within marriages, staying for the money and the security when the love and the connection is gone. Or putting up with abuse for material gain. And we can do that in all different parts of our life. Letting other people treat us poorly in exchange for money and material goods. That's the prostitute. These things can really inform us. They're calling us to grow. They're actually hopeful. Although they're archetypes of survival, we can do better. And they're calling us to do better, to grow and evolve and trust that what we really need and what we really want is possible. We don't need to compromise ourselves. We don't need to live in this dark place. It's interesting, you'll often see a family system where the mother and father are like June Cleaver and Darth Vader, where the mother's nothing but good and sweet and loving, and the father is like this horrible, alcoholic, abusive ogre. You can bet that's not coincidental. That the mother's holding all of the light and the father is holding all of the shadow. That the mother is probably like deeply fearful and resentful, and he gets to act that out for her because she won't own her shadow. He usually has deep sensitivity and insight, but has never been taught how to manage his own vulnerability and has disowned his own light, and mother gets to hold it. It's a very common dysfunctional family structure. And it certainly can be flipped. The mother can be the ogre and the father can be the loving one. Our work as humans is to integrate all of who we are. When we do that, we become stronger and wider and bigger, more resilient. Owning my rage and resentment. We all have rage and resentment. We all have fear. If you think you don't, then you're disowning your shadow. And the more we can own and incorporate it, the more it nourishes us. And we can digest the parts that are immature, this idea of turning garbage into compost. We all have animal instincts within us. We all have the ability to be oppressors and victimizers. We all have a murderer within us. It's part of being human. And the more we can own that, actually the stronger we become, because then we don't have to project it out. And we can bring the higher aspects of our nature to manage that energy in a productive way. So we can think about slavery as the institution upon which America was built. That's our shadow. How do we own and incorporate that? That's the question. I was a very small child when the civil rights movement was happening under Martin Luther King. I was born in the 60s, and the movement from the 60s to now of what's happening in civil rights is amazing. It's very encouraging. Unfortunately, social change happens slowly. Individual change can happen slowly too. But sometimes things happen very fast. But we need to know that on this plane of reality, there is always a shadow. All light casts a shadow. And the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And we never outgrow it, ever. No matter how spiritual we become, no matter how pure we think our soul is, that in itself can become a shadow. So, for example, even within this rising up of people to support the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a shadow even within that. Certainly, the idea of social justice is justice for all. So what I notice is the shadow of the social justice movement is that it really wants to shut down free speech. That anyone who doesn't agree with the social justice movement is demonized. That the social justice movement is only inclusive of those who agree with it. And if you disagree on any level with the social justice movement, then you become other and are treated with the same energy of disdain that the social justice movement actually is fighting against. Now, this is just human behavior, and it's the call to always be aware of our shadow so that we can grow, again, in maturity and effectiveness. A lot of the fallout of the Me Too movement is really pointing to shadow and how men have often used their power in an abusive way to be able to have sex with women. But if we look at the 4 archetypes of survival, the women who are victims of Me Too also have a shadow. Where do women remain victims and not own their authentic power? Where do women prostitute themselves and have sex with their boss? Where do they not stand up to authority and say no because they don't want to own the consequences? Pointing at the shadow is touchy stuff. People get defensive. They don't like it because we don't want to own these parts of ourselves that we don't like. The beauty of owning them is that they give us power. The danger of not owning them is that they end up running the show. It's like washing underpants. We always have to wash our underpants, or else we get stinky. We never outgrow washing our underpants. They will always get dirty because we're human. And having clean underpants is part of our responsibility as a mature, healthy adult. And it keeps us from messing up our regular clothes. So all light casts a shadow. And within that shadow is the seed of creativity and more power to make us bigger, stronger, more whole, to move our evolution forward. How can we participate in that process? Wash your own underpants. Look at your own self. Where are you a victim? Where are you prostituting your integrity? Where are you sabotaging yourself? What are the unhealed wounds that drive you? What are your fears, your resentments? So do your laundry. And when we do our own laundry, we're in better shape to show up whole, powerful, and mature to help our society do its laundry as well. It's not either or. So that's your work this week. Wash your underpants. Be well, stay safe. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.